maybe we should start. Look, that just happened. That's perfect. I'm David Corey. I'm the director of Baylor in Washington, D.C. I'm so glad to see so many people here. This is a terrific turnout. It's more people than we expected. Thanks for coming out in the evening like this for our panel on police reform. I have got the best panelists here, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a second. But I want to just make a couple preliminary remarks about the event. Baylor in Washington concerns itself with civic education, not only for the students who go to Washington, but also for our fellow citizens, and even for our friends here in Waco and at Baylor. And we put on events that touch on issues that are contemporary, pressing, controversial, hard to talk about, heated, emotional, and we do our best to approach these in a way that is charitable towards different positions, that listens and seeks truth and understanding rather than political points, scoring political points. We're not here to give you a political panel, and so rare, I think, in our nation these days to actually hear dispassionate, civil, charitable discourse on controversial issues. We try to model this in part because Baylor in Washington is Christian in its mission, but we do it, I think, because our city needs it so much. Our nation needs it so much. And so what we're looking to do is to understand the issue in its complexity, try to understand the facts around it, and what motivates people to take the positions that they do. I want to thank our co-sponsors, and we have a surprising number of them for this event. We had a lot of people want to come up along beside us on this. Baylor's Office of Engaged Learning, the Law School, the Department of Political Science, Prison Fellowship, Mark 43, and Waco's Public Deliberation Initiative. They've been terrific partners. I want to announce that next Thursday, at about this time, actually 6:30, and you see this thing in your chair, there's a follow-up to this event, which is going to be a debate moderated by a team of people who will come in from Washington, D.C. They're a really great organization called Braver Angels. And what they do is they take a very controversial question like, should local governments defund their police? And they have these parliamentary rules that make civil engagement really easy, and people feel like they've been heard for the first time, but they also find out that they're learning something they didn't expect to learn. And I've invited them to campus, and next Thursday they will stage a debate with our students, and it's open to the public, and people who are there who are not scheduled to give speeches will still be able to give speeches. So if you're in the audience and you want to make an argument on one side or the other, there's a lot of time for that to happen. I invite you all to come to it. I just want to be sure that it's clear, especially with Chief Victorian sitting right over here. The point is not like a protest event that we're arguing to defund the police. That's not what it is. It's really an exercise in civic deliberation on an issue that's heated and contemporary. So that's something I want to invite you to. Lastly, I just want to let you know there's time for a Q&A. And so after the panel, and especially during the panel, you might be thinking about questions that you have. Jot them down. This is your chance. We've got people here who really know what they're talking about. I'm not an expert. I'm a moderator. I have some questions that'll drive the conversation, but I can't think of every question, and I especially can't think of the ones you're thinking of. So when you have something that strikes you as a question, please jot it down, and we will try our best to get your question in the Q&A afterwards. With that, let me ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Chief of Police Sheryl Victorian.
I knew you'd start here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sheryl Victorian. I am the Chief of Police for the City of Waco, and I have been Waco's Police Chief since March the 15th, 2021, this year. I am the first African American and the first female police chief for the City of Waco. Prior to coming to Waco, I was with the Houston Police Department for 28 years. I worked my way through the ranks of the Houston Police Department, serving time on patrol, on the gang task force, working undercover in major offenders. I even worked homicide. I worked internal affairs for 3 years. I worked the training academy, child sexual abuse. I've had a great career in very different areas of the police department. I retired from the Houston Police Department as an assistant chief to take this job as the chief of police for the city of Waco. I will tell you that I have not always wanted to be a police officer. I take that back. My teenage years on, yes, I wanted to be a police officer, but early on, I was afraid of police officers. Not because my family had had any negative interactions with the police, and I don't know if anybody has ever told me that I was going to jail or the police were going to arrest me, but my mom would take me to the local grocery store, and there was a constable there, and she would just try to get me to shake this man's hand, and I would fall out literally embarrassing her at age 4 or 5 years old. And then it didn't help that one of my neighbors, a couple of years later, the Houston Police Department's helicopters used to pad, their flight path was over my mom's house. And we had gone out of town for a weekend. We came back, and this mischievous kid told me that the helicopter had landed on our street and that he was looking for Sheryl. And Sheryl was a Taurus, and oh my God, I'm Sheryl and I'm a Taurus. Now I had no idea that the police did not ask your sign when they were looking for you. But for years, for a couple of years after that, every time that helicopter flew over, if my friends and I were outside playing, we'd run and hide behind trees, bushes, cars, you name it, right? And then it wasn't until a couple of years later, my dad died I was 9, of a massive heart attack, and we were going out of town to bury him. And the solo officers, those were our motorcycle officers in Houston, as we were leaving the funeral home, my family and I exited. They were very compassionate, very empathetic, and I focused on them that ride out of town to go bury my dad, and I watched the respect that they got, and and what people were doing, what they were asking, and then my perception started to change a little bit. A couple of years after that, Miami Vice came out, the real Miami Vice, for those of you that are my age, right? Ricardo and Tubbs, and I always wanted to work undercover, and so I knew from that point on I wanted to be the police, and so I was successful at that, earned my bachelor's degree, went straight into the academy, and did the work that I just told you guys I did. So it's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to this panel discussion.
Thanks for being here. And Chief Victorian also has a PhD. She's also a professor, and in her free time, she likes to, wait for it, she's a playwright.
I am a
So
playwright.
just add that to the awesomeness.
Thank
There you go. This is Ganesha Martin.
Ganesha Martin, yes, hi, good evening. I just have to piggyback on what the chief said because, and I hope this frames our conversation for tonight because we're going to talk about some very negative things, but I also think that there is room for hope. And the reason why I say that is because, God has his hand on everything and how things happened. And I have to tell you, I was a student at Baylor, and the most racist things that ever happened to me in my life happened here on this campus. And I still remember standing up in chapel, asking about Martin Luther King's birthday and why it wasn't a holiday. And I was summarily told to sit down, and I was told by a lot of students that looked like me, why are you trying? Like, give up. And so to be here on this stage talking about race, gender, and policing, and on top of that, when I saw that she was announced as the chief, I teared up the same way I'm doing right now. I didn't plan on crying in front of you.
Don't make me
But
cry.
I did. I was proud because her job is hard, and I know that. But for her to come here and for her to be selected meant a lot for me, having the experiences that I had. Not all bad experiences here at Baylor, but again, it just resonates that I'm here on this stage to have this conversation. So, about me, I'm a lawyer by education and training. I was a journalism major here, so if the Lariat's out there, how you doing? All right, hey there. I did a study abroad in Japan while I was here, so I came back with an Asian Studies major, and then I also decided I needed a business minor, and came back and took that up, and my first class in economics, I actually cried and came back goth. I put on all this black because it was just really, it was my protest. But anyway, so when I graduated, I started practicing law, civil litigation for a while, and then quite by happenstance, I was in Texas and then New Mexico, and then by happenstance, I went to DC, met someone, and started working for the mayor of Baltimore.
This is where the story gets good.
Yeah. So I actually said I'd only work there for 1 year because the job they offered me was paying me what I used to pay in taxes as a lawyer. So I was like, this is not going to last. But I really ended up falling in love with the city because you get to see all the negative things that you hear about Baltimore really as the opposite side of the coin of all the resilience of the people who never give up and continue to fight for a better way of life. And so started working as the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety Emergency Management. Then there was a chief that was brought in from Oakland to specifically work on the relationship with Black communities and police because it was completely eviscerated from zero tolerance policing where 6 out of 10 Black people were arrested for things like open containers and things like that. It was a crime control method. So came in, I went over to be his chief of staff, working on those issues of police reform, trying to do proactive police reform. And then we started seeing shootings of unarmed Black men around the country. This is around 2015. Ferguson happened. I told the commissioner we need to create the Bureau of Community Engagement so I can focus on that. Couldn't do that with the chief of staff. And then the very next day, Freddie Gray died. So we're in the midst of the riots and the uprising. And it was my job to work on the relationships. Then the DOJ came in to investigate the police department. As you might have heard, is the last one under President Obama's administration. And essentially that's, the DOJ comes in to find out if there's a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing in Baltimore City. They found out that there was one. And so my last role there was the chief of the Department of Justice, Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs. Just a whole bunch of words to say it was my job to start creating reform at the police department, put the infrastructure there. I left because in places like Baltimore, they talk about police reform, they talk about community policing, but if bodies are still dropping, if people are still dying, then you lose your job. So I left after the police commissioner was asked to leave. Didn't want to stay for the next guy. I didn't know he was going to get indicted 4 months later, but he did for tax evasion. So I started doing consulting around the country, police reform, and went back to the mayor's office for a short amount of time to be the director of Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Left and now do consulting around the country and work with a records management company that collects data for police departments, and I use that to try to build bridges between police and community.
It's an incredible background. Heather Rice-Minus.
So good to be with you all tonight. I work with an organization called Prison Fellowship. We're the nation's largest Christian nonprofit serving people in prison, formerly incarcerated people and their families. And we're also a leading advocate for justice reform. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area myself, but I've gotten to know the Baylor and Washington program through some of the events and opportunities to interact with students in Washington, D.C. And it's been such a joy to do that. I think you all are incredibly inquisitive, and this is my first time on the Baylor campus, so it's really good to be here. Me personally, I'm a lawyer by training, or a lawyer by education, I should say, and a lobbyist by training. I spent my time working on criminal justice reform on Capitol Hill and in state legislatures, and that had been primarily my role at Prison Fellowship for the last 9 years, but recently started working on our church mobilization efforts to get churches more engaged in all that we do, including ministry behind bars, as well as our Prison Fellowship Angel Tree program, which serves children of the incarcerated. Prison Fellowship's criminal justice work has historically focused on 3 main areas: sentencing reform, prison reform, and then second chances. But in the last year, with all that has been happening, we had calls from capitals, the Capitol Hill, as well as state capitals, asking us to weigh in on policing reform. And so we decided to do that for the first time. So with all humility, I am here tonight next to my distinguished panelists, who I'm going to be, listening to every nugget that they're saying, because we're still doing a lot of learning in this space. But everything we do is informed by our ministry to those who are affected by the justice system, and we think we have something to offer in that space. And I also tend to see in debates on policing in particular that there's not enough of a strong voice from the faith community. And so I think we have something to offer there too. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight and hearing what questions you all have.
Thanks so much for those introductions. I'm looking at the time, it's 7:22. Time flies when you're having a good time. So I want to get right into our questions. Don't feel like everyone has to answer every question, and let's just sort of focus on one thing and then move on. That way we can get through a number of these questions. The first one I want to ask is whether you personally see injustices in the way policing is being or has been practiced. Do you see different demographics receiving different treatment, or are police in general fairly even-handed how they deal with different kinds of people?
I can start. You know, I think it's a good question. It's a complicated question. The way I start it is because people talk about police as if they're a special breed of human being. I mean, and there is something to that profession. You have the right to take a person's life and to take a person's freedom. So there are different. You do have to look at them as a profession differently. But if you look at it as a person that goes into work, everybody here has a bias. Everybody here has a bias. And then you take that bias that we all have, whether it's implicit or whether it's conscious, and then you take the foundation of our country. And you know, while a lot of people would like to debate about it, there are lots of our systems, including the system of policing, that were built on historic oppression. And they were built on systems that rely on there being a top and there being a bottom. And generally, the top, if you look across the world, not just America, but certainly here, the top, are not Black and brown people. Black and brown people are at the bottom. And in a capitalist society, that's the way it worked. It worked as an engine for this country to move forward. So if you start with those just basic premises, you have to accept that there is racism, there's racist people in every profession, but certainly some in policing, and that there are race-based policies and there are race-based practices that happen in policing. That is not, everybody in policing is not a bad person. There are some people that I know, I've seen confirmed text messages in my work where there's racial slurs and things like that being used. And there are chiefs that try to get those people out, and then they got their jobs back. And I've seen this across the country. So there are those folks. But I think in general, most people become police officers because they have a heart to serve and they have a heart to want to help people. And so if the systems that they're working in work harder to make sure that those biases are uncovered and then actually give them tools to actually deal with those things, because as human beings, we all have them, then I think we'd be in a better situation. But the way policing is set up right now, while there's an acknowledgement that those issues are there, I think that we are failing, and I'll put myself in that category. I think we're failing in making sure that the training and the help that is needed to overcome those biases, I think that it's not there the way it
I'll
needs
come
to
back
be.
to some of that. I like what you said because you not only gave anecdotal evidence, but you had a rather charitable comment about how widespread it is. And I think people wonder how widespread or systemic are the problems with policing? Are we dealing with a handful of exceptions and just bad incidents, but it's not the norm? Or is it more systemic than that?
So, great question. Being in police for 28 years, in my experience, I haven't seen it as a systemic issue, right? We have over 200 million calls for service that we answer every year, about 600 and something thousand calls a day, and there are a lot of good outcomes in those incidents, right? The majority are good outcomes, as opposed to some ending in a fatality or police brutality or an officer making a mistake or intentionally harming someone. So I think that we don't, I wouldn't say that it was systemic. I would say that there are a culture, once you get involved in policing, maybe you become involved in a culture where supervision accountability is not there. Because I think that a lot of the responsibilities are on our first line supervisors, but as executives, we need to be mindful that whether or not we're training our supervisors to know what to look for. So I always think in the Minnesota, in the George Floyd death, in his murder, where was the supervisor? Had Chauvin not demonstrated these behaviors before? Was there any discipline? Was there any efforts to correct his behavior? Or did everybody just wait until this incident happened to say, I knew it was going to happen? You know, and too many times in policing, when someone is arrested or they are fired, our colleagues are saying, I knew that was going to happen. I was waiting. That's why I don't let him check my own calls with me, or that's why I don't let her check my, or that's why I don't go about her calls. So we need to do a better job at creating a culture of where it's okay to correct our fellow officers' behavior and prepare our supervisors with the right knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to identify these behaviors, do audits on body-worn camera footage, look at these behaviors, and then be able to responsibly address those behaviors.
We put gender and race right up front. I did that, and I'm not an expert, and in a way I'm kind of assuming, and I have no reason to assume it, but I'm assuming that among the things that most need reform, issues around gender and race would count very high, but I don't want to necessarily assume that. I mean, what do you think most needs reform in our policing today?
So I know for us, like, we have three major bucket areas that we're looking at, whether that's some of the things that have already been mentioned. I think training is a big one, and making sure that there is adequate training. Things like crisis intervention training have been shown to be incredibly helpful to working with people who have mental illness and de-escalating the situation. Also the bucket of accountability. I mean, if you have someone who everyone knows is a problem, but there's not a system in place to make sure that that person is held accountable, then actually the system itself needs to be held accountable as well. And then the other area we're really looking at, of course, and lots of states are throughout the country are making reforms in the area of the use of force standards. That's lethal use of force as well as non-lethal use of force. But oftentimes the standards may be good, maybe they're not specific enough, but then it's the real-time training to ensure that someone is in a high intense situation, being able to maintain those standards of use of force. And so those are some of the areas that we're seeing kind of crop up in reform. And we know that, you know, there are implications for race, of course. We see that the use of force or the threat of use of force is higher among Black Americans than white Americans. But I do want to make the point, which I think you were also saying, Ganesha, is, you know, this is pervasive throughout the criminal justice system. A Black man is 6 times more likely to go to prison than a white man. Black women twice as likely than a white woman. And, you know, I work in helping children of incarcerated parents. 1 in 27 children have an incarcerated parent in our country. It goes down to 1 in 9 when we talk about Black children in this country. And so I think there's lots of areas where we can see reform, and all of those have implications for race.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing I'll add to that. I think training is very important, and we talk about that all the time. But there's 18,000 police departments in the United States, and they all can do it very differently. And so, you know, there are some folks that haven't touched their use of force policy, you know, since the 70s, and then some that are trying to stay on the leading edge. So I think there's, if you know, coming up with a national standard, be very hard to enforce, but a national standard, particularly around use of force, particularly around de-escalation and people in mental and behavioral health crisis, I think is important. You also mentioned gender and race, and so you know, we're involved in a movement called 30 by 30. And the idea behind 30 by 30 is to get at least 30% of women in policing by 2030, because that's the tipping point for culture change. It's been about 12% for the past 20, 25 years. It hasn't moved. And if you look at study after study, it shows women use force less, women shoot less, women problem solve more. And so, you know, the question that we keep raising is, if we're talking about reimagining policing and we're talking about reforming the police, what's women's role in that conversation? And obviously policing is a very male-dominated space. We're changing that with the chiefs. But that's part of what we really have to talk about, how we shift.
Do women suffer at the hands of police in a way that's different from men?
Yeah, I mean,
is that a thing?
Yes, definitely. I mean, you obviously, and I'm working in a city right now where there was a police who was serially raping women. You know, so in that regard, you know, that's an issue. One of the things that you're seeing also too is the arresting of more Black young girls That is very different than what it has been in the past. And so that's happening more often. That's a whole nother conversation around school resource officers and things of that nature. But I would say that there's, to her point with the statistics, that there is some disparate treatment based maybe more so off of race than gender.
Okay.
One area that I think that we can do a better job at, that's a part of the police reform, is recruiting and hiring. I just found out today, as a matter of fact, in a conversation on my way here, a colleague of mine in Houston said that effective September the 1st, that law enforcement agencies are now able to share the jackets or the profiles of officers that they've let go. And that has been a problem in law enforcement, where we didn't share information, or where, sometimes chiefs didn't have the courage to be honest when somebody is leaving their police department and give them a dishonorable discharge, and as opposed to an honorable discharge, which if you're going to another agency and they see that it's a general or dishonorable discharge, they know to ask questions, right? But if it's honorable, you think that they left, everything was fine, right? So I think we can do a better job, now that I heard that this past September the 1st, that now we're able to share information from agency to agency so that we'll know who we're hiring. And also in that recruitment process, and I don't know how well this is gonna go over, but I think that it's important that when we're asking for references, that we ask for a diverse group of references. Particularly if you're going into a community that's really diverse. You need to know that you need to be, you know how to communicate and how to address people of different colors or different backgrounds or different cultural backgrounds. But those are two areas.
I've read that one of the things you encourage, or maybe it's a policy that you're implementing, is to diversify the Waco police force. And one reason can be what Ganesha said, that women are less likely to escalate violence. But there's another reason too, isn't there? I mean, it's something about the effectiveness of policing when the police look like you, right?
Yes. When so one of the questions that I was asked several times during the process was, our department is not representative of our city. Now, I got a couple of things to say about that. So our department is 77% white. The city is 40% white, 30% Hispanic, and 20% African American, right? So they kept asking me, well, I can't go and push officers out, and I'm not going to push officers out, right? So with attrition, we'll do a better job. We'll have long-term and short-term plans of being able to recruit minorities and those that represent the department. But right now, I think that we have an opportunity. People are like, okay, yeah, we're top-heavy, more white males than anybody else. Well, what are we seeing when we're looking in the news, when we're seeing these shootings of unarmed African-American men? Most of the guys that are doing the shooting are white males, right? So this is an opportunity for us as a police agency with our heavy white males to go into the community to show them that we're not what they're seeing on TV. This is our opportunity to connect and engage with the community to help change those perspectives, to have those positive contacts.
I do just want to add to that, the presumption by community is if you look like me, you respond to me the same. It's not always true. You have some folks that look just like you and treat you worse. So that's the first thing. But I will say I'm the impact director on a film called Women in Blue. And there is a portion of that film where the only black sergeant, actually this is in the Minneapolis Police Department, so it was filmed before George Floyd. But she stops a young black man and she walks up to him and she says to him, license and registration. And he says, I don't have my license. And she goes, that's why you're nervous. It's okay. And that simple recognition of him being nervous and that being why. But we know in academies across the country, when a person is nervous and they're making furtive movements, then the officer is trained to escalate for officer safety issues. So you might say, sir, can you step out of the car? Now, what's going on in that? They're getting more nervous, legs shaking, and it's not any malfeasance. The officer is being trained that the moment you're not hypervigilant, you will die. So, that's where we talk about restructuring public safety and the conversation we have to have The young man is scared because he really has seen people die in these encounters. But this police officer's also been trained in the academy that if he's not hypervigilant, he might die. They are set up for failure. The structure needs to be changed to recognize and reinforce the humanity in that instance, and that's what's not going on right now. And that's a piece of policing that needs to be reformed the most, but it's the most sticky and the most difficult.
That's interesting. Also, as we talk about these kinds of reforms and trainings and different ways of looking at things, we're doing it against the backdrop of studies I've been reading that more and more police officers are retiring or getting out at a very rapid rate, citing as reasons the pressure is too much, that they can't perform what's being asked of them. Is that a credible? Do you see that happening too? This might be good news if you're trying to reshape a police force, but it's bad news. Are we actually putting police in a no-win situation?
I wouldn't say that we were putting police in a no-win situation, but I do have officers that I've known who have retired or who have left policing because they don't want to be the next person in the news. And they're afraid that, because we're put in situations each and every day where we have to draw our weapon and potentially have to pull the trigger or take someone's life, right? And the last thing that we need is for an officer to second guess his actions because he doesn't want to, and he would be justified in someone who has a weapon or who is trying to shoot him, and he just because he doesn't want to be in the news and be that face, right? So I've heard that happen, and officers, I don't know if you've heard the term of depolicing, officers not being as proactive in calls because they're afraid that they may have that one situation, that one incident that will draw negative attention to them and have them in national news, their agency in national law enforcement national news. So yes, I have heard of that.
You know, just real quick to add to that. So like I said, I still do consulting around the country, and I was talking to a chief not too long ago. He was a white chief, but he told me how he had to take his black officers off the protest line because tears were coming down their face. And I can tell you, when I worked for the police, my family was not always supportive. But I knew that being at the table made a difference, and so I just stuck it out. You know, to have things hurled at you, particularly when you've showed up to be that change, and to have that happen, it can take a toll on you mentally. And when I thought about this question, I'm just going to run down a list of stuff that I know that police are dealing with now. So record number of suicide with police. The number one killer of police this year has been COVID. The protest, and the protests don't just happen on the news. They happen just when you show up for a call for service now. Cameras on you, things being hurled at you, names being hurled at you. The defund. And we're probably going to talk about defund a little bit, but when you hear defund as a police, that means you're trying to take my job to take care of my family. So that's scary, right? Violence, all-time high, record high violence. Being a political football, which police are, you know, domestic terrorism, it's on the rise, and dealing with people in mental behavioral health crisis, drug addiction, and houselessness. That all fall on police. It is quite a bit.
Okay, here's a somewhat more technical one that I think might be in Heather's wheelhouse. I'm not sure. I was reading some articles about stuff going on in Baltimore, and I noticed that there really are two strategies when it comes to what kinds of things you pay attention to. Some experts are saying pay less attention to lighter offenses and focus instead on more serious crimes. I think from a prison reform perspective, this looks appealing because you have less people then going to prison. But others argue that that's actually backfiring. It's better to take lighter offenses seriously and punish them in order to deter the feeling that nothing happens when you break the law. Is one or the other of those two strategies better?
So I think it depends on what we mean by take something seriously and what we're talking about in terms of light offenses. Because if we're really dealing with a shortage of resources to respond, then I think you're triaging and you have to respond to violent crime first, of course. I do think when it comes to lighter offenses that we have to think outside the bars. We have to, if we're not talking about incarceration, I would say those are opportunities to actually create an intervention for someone before it escalates. And there's also a lot of data showing that swift and certain sanctions are very effective. Letting someone know that you actually will get caught and there will be a swift form of accountability that doesn't have to be incarceration. It could be a drug court. It could be a fine. It could be community service. But that you're actually going to have to be held accountable for that is still important. So I think it really does have to be both. At the same time, we know that there are a lot of very serious crimes, including homicides, that go without resolution. And we need to be able to focus resources on those, and there are also usually a lot of pockets of, that's why we have hotspot policing, is to focus in on where we know that there are a few actors who are really permeating a lot of violent crime in a particular community. And there's been a lot of evidence to show that it's very effective to have police focus on those areas that are known to have the most violent activity.
That's helpful. We'll turn to questions in just a few minutes, and I want to let everybody know we actually have a few hundred people watching this online, and they're going to be able to ask questions too. Nobody's mentioned, in terms of reforms, the idea that police find themselves doing all kinds of work that isn't really policing, and that maybe mental health experts would in some ways be better fit to deal with some of the things that police are ordinarily called out for: homelessness, kinds of behavior in public that reflects mental health problems. Is that something that can happen within the rubric of police reform? And I say it that way, of course, because it's one of the things that the defunders are saying: take money away from the police in order to finance these other kinds of activities.
Something that we really found effective in the city of Houston was a program that we had where we had mental health professionals riding in patrol cars with our officers, and when someone called the police because their family member was in a mental health crisis, we would send those units. But the tables turn when that individual has a weapon. So we can position ourselves for that individual to try to communicate with that person, but the minute a weapon is displayed or pointed, we don't want to put that person in harm's way. One thing that we have done in Waco in the past month or so was to hire a social worker to work with our career criminal apprehension supervision team. And what that person does is so that team's responsibility was to identify individuals that we were being called on the most. And we found out that the most people we were getting calls on were people with mental illness. And so we partnered with Prosper Waco, a Waco Connect, and hired a social worker to work with that team. And that individual is responsible for directing us to resources to best address the mental health needs of these consumers before they get into a crisis, right? We identify these individuals, we see what their needs are, we connect with their family members, and we try to provide a service to reduce the number of times that they come in contact with the police.
Heather's comment about triage and having to pick your battles suggests to me, at least, that in some cases resources for police departments are not adequate. And this of course goes directly against the defund narrative. I guess I'm asking, are police forces generally adequately financed? And then secondly, what is motivating the defund the police movement?
Oh, go ahead if you want.
Well, I'm going to leave that first question for you all to answer, but I do want to just share, this is coming out next month, Prison Fellowship every 2 years. We partner with the Barna Group, who does polling, historically a lot of focus on American Christian perceptions, particularly evangelical perceptions, and we have been asking them to survey on crime and incarceration perceptions among Americans generally and Christians in particular. And this year we added some questions related to policing. We actually gave, in our survey that's coming out next month, you'll be able to see the results online, we gave 10 options. Police reform's been talked about a lot. If you could prioritize one police reform from this list, or none at all, or another, what would be your top choice? Number one choice by far among both Americans and practicing Christians was greater training for de-escalation. The least selected choice was, we called it redistribution of resources. So
Okay.
this question. So it was just sort of interesting how low, more people said they didn't want any reforms than said redistribution of resources. So it's interesting how strong that narrative has been, but how few Americans, at least from our survey, which has only so much of a margin area, are like making that their narrative.
I've seen this happen on multiple issues where people can be so intense about it that there's the perception that it's very widespread and widely approved. Yeah.
That happens in policing a lot. We were just talking about this. I was interviewed, and police reform, because it gets so much attention, has made superstars out of people. So it's not even folks that 100% believe in the mission or even think about the mission. It's just they want social media attention or something like that. And, when you talk about defund the police, you ask, what do people want from it? Let's take the people who I think have genuine motivations. I think what they're saying is the system does not work. And it looks like we invest because in police departments across the country, they have the biggest budgets, 400 million, like all these huge numbers. But what's never talked about is most of those numbers, 95%, are wages and retirement. And so you have about 5% to get technology, to maybe have a community policing program, but very little money to do those things that really should have been happening way upstream. So defund, say, take money from police and give it to these other systems. No, if you would have invested in those systems in the first place, then you wouldn't have to call the police. If you would invest in education, if you invest in transportation, I was talking earlier in Baltimore City. I grew up in Dallas, but in Baltimore City is where I learned about redlining. I never knew about it. It was the where redlining began. And you can go back to when redlining started. For those of you who don't know, it's the, basically where mortgages were not given to minorities. And those are now the places that are called ghettos. Those are now the places that, and have endemic poverty. But those are the same places where you don't have good education. You have lead in the water. You have, rats running around schools and textbooks that are 20 years old. You don't have buses and transportation that take you to jobs that you can have living wages. And so that's what I think they're saying is take that money. But what I say is look at the way the government spends all their money, because just because you take money from the police and give it to social services, there's a lot of people who would say social services cause harm to their families. So it's blaming one person when I think we need to look at the entire system.
Based on this panel, the premise that you started out with for the motivation behind these defunders, which is that, look, the system doesn't work, ...
Yeah.
This panel doesn't agree with that. Sheryl Victorian just told me the system is not the problem. There's a ton of good being done here. So it seems, I don't know how one gets to the premise that the system doesn't work.
The system doesn't work.
What system are we talking about?
She was missing, exactly. She was talking about something very different. I mean, she has to get called out. I'm sorry, I don't need to talk for you, but I mean, her people are getting called out to people in mental and behavioral health crisis, and they're having to have that CIT training because the government overall and society overall has failed people that are in mental and behavioral health crisis. And the police are the only people that you can call, and they have to say, yes, ma'am, I'll go for it. They can't say, well, I'm not going to do that today. And so the system has failed because police are asked to do everything, even with the mask mandate, which is completely ridiculous. We know that police have strained relationships with Black and brown communities. They had disparate, outcomes with COVID, but you're going to send police in to enforce mask mandates as opposed to a public health person. So again, that system who puts police in those positions is absolutely failing, and then police are getting blamed for showing up and doing work that they were never trained to do in the first place.
And it seems that the long-term effect of this, and this worries me very much, is that we are facing something like a crisis of legitimacy for the police. Increasingly, I don't have numbers, but increasingly, the police are perceived as illegitimate, which gets you to the abolitionist position, for example, on this issue, that there shouldn't be police. But you're helping me to understand that part of the reason this happens is because of the police are being asked to do so much. I think this might be a good time to take some questions. Seems natural. And so folks who have questions, I'd love to entertain them. And then I'm getting, we have some mics. And I'll have some of the Baylor and Washington folks help get you a mic if you want to ask a question. And then also, I'm going to use this device to see some of the questions that are coming in from the viewers online. And I'll select those when I think it's right. OK, see if you can get to this mic. Or here comes Beth Butler to help.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm just very honored to be in front of you, very strong women, and speaking to an audience like this. It's just really humbling to be able to witness y'all's intelligence, so I appreciate that. And I wanted to touch a little bit whenever we talked about, instead of using the term defund, using the term redistribute. And based on this last question that we've had, I'm noticing that it's less of a redistribution of funds that we might need. It might be a redistribution of priority. And so I just wanted to ask Dr. Victorian if you had an idea of what that might look like as chief of police here in Waco and just in police in general.
Distribution of priorities. So one of my priorities as the chief of police for the city of Waco was to increase the number of positive interactions that we had with our community. When do people call the police? When something bad has happened, right? When there's tragedy, right? So again, one of my priorities is to make sure that we create programs where we are increasing the positive interactions that we have with our community, to understand one another's perspective, to invite people into our home, into our tower, into our programs, so that you can ask those tough questions, we can have those tough conversations. So I would say that we need to reinvest in those programs that would allow us to have those more positive contacts, because part of our responsibility is to protect and serve, right? So recently with the Waco Police Department, we had a back to school bash, right? And it was ginormous, and we had so much community support. And we don't have the money to do that, so guess what? We reached out to our community partners, and they stood up really big. And we invited our community to our campus. How often, when you invite somebody to your house, you feel welcome, right? And that's somebody you trust. So that's what we are focusing on. We're focusing on inviting more of the community into our house to ask those questions, to have those positive contacts. So when something happens across the country that negatively affects policing or that tarnishes our badge, that they can go, you know what, the Waco, they don't paint us with a broad brush.
Yeah.
That's not the Waco Police Department, because we've gone to our Waco Police Department. They care about our community. They care about us.
I just want to register that you just answered what somebody had asked online. With defunding police departments on the rise, do you see private sector resources growing in order to supplement your training and other law enforcement needs? You talk about these community partners coming alongside and helping.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our community partners were very, very strong in supporting our efforts, and will continue to be strong. I mean, when I got here, everybody was saying, hey, we're here to help, whatever you need, whatever you need. We called on our community partners, and they stood up, and they were true to their words.
It ideally would be. I think the questioner's wondering that if that's being defunded, do we see somebody standing up to support the training? You're right to make the distinction, though. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd welcome any other questions. I do have a couple other ones from online, but Michael, let's get you a mic. Beth?
Thank you all for being here. I was just wondering, you've discussed a lot of potential solutions here tonight. If you just had one, what's the most effective thing a police department can do to improve its community relations?
Thank you, Michael.
For me, it is hold itself accountable and communicate that to the community. And holding yourself accountable as a police department means different things. For some people, that means less use of force, or improving how you engage with people in mental and behavioral health crisis. And then being open and sharing that. One of the projects that I'm working on right now takes all of the data that police capture and then pushes it out to community on a public-facing dashboard, so that you can have that collaborative, type of conversation. But holding yourselves accountable and then communicating that out, I think that that's critical.
And I would say relational policing. I know you said one thing, but relational policing is a couple of things, right? And we can go on and talk about that at another time, but there's a tenet of relational policing that spells out the word treat, T-R-E-E-A-T, right? So relational policing involved building genuine cooperative relationships through transparency, respect, engagement, building emotional capital, holding ourselves accountable. And I feel like that transparency, respect, engagement, building that emotional capital through that engagement, respect, and transparency and accountability builds that last T, which is trust.
Yeah. And just to piggyback on that, we moved several years ago to a predominantly black neighborhood in Ward 8 of DC in Southeast. And I can remember the first week we moved into our brand new house, our brand new townhouse, some teenagers broke in through the door, kicked open the door. My husband was home. They thought, I think, looking back on the situation, I think they thought that the newly built townhouse was vacant, and they were just having some fun. I don't know why that's fun, but you know, it took about like a half an hour. My husband ran up. There was a hammer out from when he was putting up pictures. Ran up with a hammer. Luckily, they ran away. Nothing happened, but our door, you know, was ruined. And so we called the police. Took about half an hour, even though we're a mile away, to get to our house. And I can still remember the police officer, and I'm kind of thrown a little bit, and my husband fixed the door right away. Just, you know, started nailing it. And when they got there, they're like, well, you ruined the evidence. And next time this happens, and I'm thinking, next time? And so I love what you just said, Chief, because I think, you know, there's a lot to be said. A lot of communities where we're seeing a lot of this violence, this is their day-to-day, right? And when you get a call, if you can build that relationship and rapport and validate victims of crime, no matter how small, how large, that makes the world of difference when you have a positive interaction with someone that shows they truly care about your community, they care about what's happened to you, and that they're here to help, right? Not just log this and make sure you did it right? So.
As women, do you encounter a culture of masculinity / brotherhood in police departments? Is that a huge barrier for female officers?
Wow, that was a good one right there. You say that with some of my colleagues out in the audience here. No, I'm just kidding. So yes, policing is a male-dominated profession, females only make up about 13% of law enforcement officers across this country. Female police chiefs make up about 3% of that number of leaderships or chiefs across the country. I was very fortunate when I went into the Houston Police Department. There were many women before me that it really kind of paved the way. My biggest issue was a partner who he felt like he needed to take care of me and that he was being chivalrous. When we go to a call, you can stay in a car. I mean, it wasn't like, I don't think she can do the job, because you can tell I'm not a little girl. And I haven't been this for a long time. So, you know, he would say, I got it. And then it took like 2 or 3 calls for me to go, and I was a rookie, and I had to ride with somebody, right? And I was like, I want to know. I need to learn. I'm getting out of the car. And sure enough, I get out of the car and we go to a scene, and it's a domestic violence incident, and the male suspect is getting into it with my partner. They're going toe to toe. But I noticed every time that our perpetrator would curse, he'd look at me and say, "I'm sorry, ma'am." And he'd go, and I'm like, opportunity, right? So I just kind of nudged my partner to the side, and I started talking to the gentleman since I was a ma'am. And we de-escalated that situation, and my partner learned to use me.
That's right.
At that point. So yes, but I haven't had any male-dominated brotherhood cultures. I've really always been received, and I had the best compliment that happened to me today as an African-American female chief in a predominantly white agency. I had one of my supervisors, a white male, came into my office just today, made me feel very good. And he was like, "I'm not trying to butter you up or anything." He said, "I've been on this floor many times." He said, "I've been here for more than 20 years. And he said, and never had I walked down this hall and I saw pictures of our chiefs and smiled. He said, I was there the other day and I looked up and I saw you and I smiled. And that just warmed my heart. It warmed my heart because he wasn't looking at me as a female. He wasn't looking at me as an African American. He was looking at me as his chief. And that made me feel really good. And I'm not going to cry. But you can cry. It's okay to cry. I just want you to know it is okay to cry, and that's a different conversation in and of itself in the police profession. It's okay.
I didn't know that until I met Ganesha, but now I do know it's okay to cry. Ganesha, you're going to want to, you've already started to address this question, so you might be interested. Having mental health professionals respond to calls is still a retroactive solution. What are some proactive solutions to decrease the 200 million calls police get every year? That's back to your system.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple. Fix society, There's a couple of things that are happening. So, some people are using telephone reporting units so that, the calls, certain calls are going to people that are just, answering the phone, but then that goes back to the relational. At that time, it doesn't matter what it is, that door is your crisis, and you want somebody to come and help you. But the one place that you're finding a lot of overlap and agreement with police and activists is that there should be somebody else showing up beyond police. So like in Albuquerque, they've created the only standalone that I know of in the country, only standalone new city agency is called Albuquerque Crisis Services, I think. And it's 100% made up of civilians. And so the call comes into 911, and the dispatch and the call taker makes the decision to either send police or to send a civilian response. And so that's starting to happen more and more around the country.
Good. By the way, you guys are not doing well at asking questions. Well, gosh, now you put your hands up. Get a mic, because the Zoom crowd is just killing you guys. Come on.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. My name is Hannah, and I'm a student at Truett Seminary. And so I wanted to ask you guys, what is the ethical obligation of the church in the criminal justice system?
She went deep.
So, yes, I'm here for it. So, one of the things I've really, our organization was founded by the late Chuck Colson. Many of you may not know that name, but he was special counsel to President Nixon, got involved in the Watergate scandal, and spent 7 months in federal prison as a result of that. And through that process, he committed his life to Christ, and he got out and founded our ministry, ensuring that he would never leave the men he met inside behind. And I think, there's so many prison ministries, I feel like, across the country, not just Prison Fellowship. And, looking back, I've been reading his memoir, Born Again. He was a prolific writer, very well known in the evangelical community. And I think Chuck Colson did an amazing job igniting the church to recognize that we have a call, a scriptural call, right, in Matthew 25 and Hebrews 13:3 to visit those in prison, to remember those in prison. But I feel like the church, and if you look at the Barna poll, and we're going to release next month, sometimes we miss the mark in connecting that we not only have to bring the hope of the gospel to individuals behind bars. We want to do that. We want to bring in a Bible study. There's not a prison or jail in this country that is short of Bible study volunteers. But we struggle to realize that we have to bring the gospel to bear in the public square, and that we have to be part of advocating when we see injustice. When we see injustice in policing, when we see it in sentencing, in how people are treated in prison, and post-release, when people come home and they can't find a job, right? And so I am really excited, because what we see in our polling is that the younger generation, those of you sitting here, it's connecting for you as Christians. And so I'm very excited about that, and I would encourage you to walk away from today feeling like, man, we got to fix society, as Ganesha said, right? But there is something you can do. It can be simple. It can be as simple as signing up to be an advocate with Prison Fellowship. We train people on how to do that, how to contact your lawmakers, and then volunteer. Do something in direct capacity. Volunteer with your local law enforcement. Be one of those community partners, right? Or get to know people in prison or post-release, or with Angel Tree children who have an incarcerated parent. There is a way to get involved, but I do think we need to make that connection and call to the church to recognize that our values not only mean that we have to care about the individual, but we have to care about systems.
Chief, what are some things that caring Christian citizens can do with the Waco Police?
So we have a whole lot of we have volunteer opportunities when we're doing community outreach, internal and external. So we have our Citizens Police Academy that we have. It's a 12-week program. You come in for 3 hours a week and you learn about your police academy, your police department, and then after that you can join the Citizens Police Academy Alumni Association, and they do a lot of volunteer work, like I said, when we're out and about in the community, or you can just volunteer and come. We have a victim services volunteer program where now we're being more trauma-centered, more trauma-informed, because let's say, for instance, example, last night we had a shooting of a two-year-old, right? And we go to this location and we identify those who may have been involved, because everybody is impacted by seeing a 2-year-old get shot and killed, because of someone who was careless or reckless with being a responsible gun owner. And so people are impacted by that because 2-year-olds are not supposed to die, and they're definitely not supposed to die by gunfire, right? So our peer support, they get trained to go out into the community, and we have conversations with those people and be a resources for individuals who may have experienced trauma. So we do have a volunteer program for that as well.
That was such a great question. I want 3 more questions from this group, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
Hello. A lot of great discussion here. Just wanted to ask, we've been talking a lot about systemic issues, how it's kind of the system is what's creating a lot of these problems. Policy-wise, what are some ways that we can go about, creating new laws to maybe try and fix some of these systemic issues?
Well, I think that the Justice and George Floyd Policing Act was actually a good way for that to happen. And as you might have heard, it fell through 2 days ago. And I think part of the issue is, if you really look at it, let's just take use of force. You always hear about the prolific unions, that fight everything. But there is some space for people to actually agree. But things have become so political that it's like you can't, the police get lost in the shuffle, and the community gets lost in the shuffle, because it's either, your party says it's this or your party says it's that. And so, conversations around what's the best thing to do for people, is 100%, getting lost. So the use of force, the tracking and reporting out on uses of force actually had decent support from police and activists. So I think that that's a great place. And then also, again, like we've talked about several times, just reimagining policing and not having police show up to certain calls. And I think the other thing that's really important, and the chief brought this up, and actually, if somebody wants to help, I'm thinking that you and I should do a program together, and we need some smart students to evaluate it. So I'm just saying, we'll talk to you about this.
Baylor and Washington wants in. We got dibs.
But also part of the policy also too is telling the other side of what police do on a daily basis.
I feel like the media is letting us down there.
Well, they're actually, you know what? I would say they're letting us down, but they're actually, unfortunately, doing their job, because you got to look at yourself in the mirror, because when you see something pop up on notice, police play with the kids today. Do you click on that? Or 5 people killed, police arrested. You're like, did you? So
And sharing it.
right, and sharing it, and exactly, and all that sort of stuff, and so media gets paid off of clicks.
Yeah.
So I mean, we are part of the problem. That's why they report that stuff out. So. But we do have to get to a point where we're actually helping the community understand what police do, because the better they're informed, the better they're part of the process of creating, the solution for the future.
I saw a couple questions over here. Grant, take your pick.
Hi, I'm Becca Gonzalez. I'm an undergrad student here. I'll graduate soon. When you get that program together, I'll give you my contact info, and you can just call me and let me know. So my question is kind of culmination of what y'all have been saying from the previous questions. It works out. How do rising professionals, as we are often so called, but also people who use social media a lot. How do we stand in the gap, not just in our feed, but when we go home to Thanksgiving dinners? You know, when we have diverse friend groups at college, or maybe not, and then we go home and we have a very white, you know, family gathering. You know, how do you stand in the gap between defund the police and then on the other side of like back the blue and, you know, F everyone else, which is my family context. So it's how do we, from this conversation, I'm hearing a lot of like, it's not one-dimensional. How do we stand in that without everything in us suffering and getting tired, and also just change, like make change happen on this social level? Because we can't do anything systemic yet. We're not professionals yet. But what can we do now with what we have?
So you can do a lot. I mean, quite frankly, probably a lot of us are here in this work because, you know, young people stood up and said, yeah, this is not cool anymore. And it was people from diverse backgrounds and that did that. What I have found to be helpful is where I don't engage like like a lawyer and argue. What I say is like, well, you know, I heard that, you know, such and such and such happened. And then I'll give you an example. So when I did the use of force policy outreach in Baltimore, I had community come in, and they were pissed at the police. Could barely even get them to come in the door. And one of the things they were really mad about was that in Baltimore, you often would see police sit young black men on the curb, called curbing them. And, you know, they said that is disrespectful and, you know, degrading and all that. And I said, that's true. So I asked the police, I said, why do you do that? And they said, well, we don't have the divider in the cars that if you sit them in the back of the car, then they could jump over, they can jump for something. So we have to sit them there and we tell them to cross their legs just in case they're going to get up. They have to uncross their legs and we have a chance to get them. So when I told the community that, they said, well, they need to buy them those dividers. So then they went to the commissioner and they said, buy them the dividers. And what did they have, you know, months later was those dividers. And so who would have ever thought out of all that anger that was going to come? So I have this concept of let's meet in the middle. And so I try to just kind of almost, you know, throw it out there. Well, did you know, I actually heard a police chief say X, Y, and Z, or, you know, it's just little by little by little, and you can see people start to change a little bit.
I would just add to that too. We have a volunteer program called Justice Ambassadors, and we train everyday Christians on how to change two things. Law, which is I think what most people think about when they think of an advocacy program, but culture. And it's exactly what you're just describing, right? Those conversations at your dinner table. And I think you really, you know, two tactics or two important things with persuading someone. I think in our day and age, we've lost the art of persuasion. Like we just all want to like shout our opinion and jam it down someone's throat. We've really lost the art of persuasion. And I think, you know, what comes with that is relational equity. And of course, with your family and friends, like you've got a ton of relational equity already, right? And then the other thing I teach my staff, as well as our Justice Ambassadors, is a lot of people think when you're a lobbyist, you got to go in, make all of your points, kind of jam it down their throats of what, you know, why you're right. A really good lobbyist is a really good listener. And you ask them good questions. Oh, well, tell me why you think that. And as you listen, right, then you get the chance to do what Ganesha just said. You get to say, well, you know, I heard a police chief say, or, you know what, I just read this new report and the stats show. So those would be my recommendations.
That's good.
That's good.
And I don't really have a whole lot to add, except if you come and get involved with us and you can say from your personal experience, well, I went on a ride along with a police officer, and when he made that decision, this is what he told me. This is why he told me he made that decision, you know. Or I went to the Citizens Police Academy that we have twice a year at the Waco Police Department. And I learned, right, shameless look. And I learned, you know, from the SWAT team, or this is why they make a decision, or doing a traffic stop, that this is why they do what they do. And you'll have that firsthand knowledge. hey, and maybe next time you can come. Now I'm a member of the Citizens Police Alumni Association. Maybe, you go home and see if there's a local, your local police department also have a Citizens Police Academy, and have them to, get involved that way or recommend it, plant the seed.
I think it might be a good idea to end like this. I know that all three of you are animated by hope. I know it about Ganesha because she said so in the very first comment that she made, right? She mentioned that she's hopeful. What's that hope look like? What is the substance of your hope?
Look,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the fact that you are here, no matter what you believe, it gives me hope because, and the debate next week, because we don't have to agree with each other, but if we care about our society, if we care about humanity, then it's worth having the conversation. And the truth of the matter is that you can get to a space of something that you actually agree upon, and you put everything that you are and your spheres of influence behind it, and you will make a difference. And so that's simple. Just the fact that you've shown up and shows that you care and you want to do something about it.
I love that.
Amen.
Join me in thanking our panelists.